So in today's video, I'm talking about what to avoid when someone violates your boundaries in relationships. So in this video, you're going to learn how to spot somebody who violates boundaries and what not to do so that you can protect yourself. But if you're new, my name's Michelle Ferris. I'm a psychotherapist and I love helping people create relationships at work. So people who violate boundaries are really good at getting what they want and kind of busting through other people's limits. If you've ever had this happen, say me too in the comments. I know how frustrating it is, but this video is going to help. There are certain traits of people who violate boundaries that you need to be aware of. The first one is they don't necessarily care about your feelings. They also tend to miss social cues. They don't recognize when somebody is uncomfortable or they've lost eye contact because they're much more focused on what they want than what you want. They also tend to have a hard time listening or recognizing that this is a problem. They also may have narcissistic traits. And they often gaslight you when you challenge their behavior. Because a person who violates boundaries tends to be a pretty strong-willed personality. They tend to take over a lot and overstep and not really understand why people are reacting the way they are. Some examples of boundary violations might be someone standing too close to you, getting in your personal space, not respecting your privacy, telling you how you should live your life, or not taking no for an answer. These are some very common boundary violations you want to be aware of. So next, we're going to talk about behaviors I want you to avoid when dealing with someone who's violating boundaries. The first thing is don't stay quiet when somebody's violating your boundaries, because that gives them the permission that it's actually okay for them to violate your boundaries because you're not speaking up. Silence conveys that message that that behavior is going to be tolerated. And in fact, once that becomes a pattern, that other person is going to keep violating your boundaries with increased frequency. It's going to get worse, not better over time, because that silence is their permission to keep going. The next thing I don't want you to do is I don't want you to get defensive when somebody's violating your boundaries. And even though it's totally understandable for you to have a reaction, for you to get defensive means that most likely you're feeling emotionally triggered. That is not the time to talk this out or stand up for yourself. When you're emotionally triggered, probably in that fight, flight, or freeze response, you're probably not going to be able to control what you say and what you do as effectively because of that fight or flight response. Because that's when our heart rate is increased, we're sweating, we're really upset, and we feel compelled to defend ourselves. The next thing I want you to avoid when someone is violating your boundaries is I don't want you to stay with that person, because what that's going to do is you're going to get increasingly upset and anxious being around them. Because when somebody violates your boundaries, it's really uncomfortable. And if you don't let yourself leave and take care of yourself and you stay in it because you want to give them the benefit of the doubt, or you assume that maybe it's your fault, maybe you're blaming yourself instead of realizing that this is a toxic behavior, that's actually going to contribute to a lot more negative thinking and anxiety, and I don't want that for you. Because really with a boundary buster, you need to vote with your feet, which means a lot of times you're going to just have to leave the situation, because that's the best boundary you can set with someone who violates boundaries. Now the next thing I want you to avoid when someone is violating your boundaries is I don't want you to ignore the red flags. Because when somebody violates your boundaries and oversteps, especially after you've called them on it and said, hey, this behavior is uncomfortable, I really need you to back up, that is a major red flag. And part of what we need to do to have healthy relationships is to be able to spot those red flags in relationships early so that they don't come back and bite us later. And someone violating your boundaries is a huge red flag, especially when it's coupled with you already talking to them about it and them not caring about your feelings. That for me is when the boundary buster becomes toxic. When I've said already that the boundary is not okay with me and they clearly don't care about my feelings. That's really important information, because that tells me that they don't care about your feelings. And that's probably the biggest red flag I would ever look for in relationship, is lack of accountability and lack of caring about your well-being. Because you're never going to have a healthy relationship with someone who continuously violates your boundaries. If you've ever had your boundaries violated, say me too in the comments. You're not alone. This video is going to help. The next thing I want you to avoid when dealing with someone who's violating your boundaries is I don't want you to use passive-aggressive statements as a way to respond. Because sometimes when we don't want to be direct in our upset, it tends to leak out in passive-aggressive ways like sarcasm or hurtful comments that really don't make sense, but we're trying to get a point across without actually saying that we're upset. That just contributes to the dysfunction in the relationship, and you can do better than that. If you notice you want to say something, you can say something, but do it when you're calm. If you're not ready to say something because it's not safe, that's totally okay. But try to avoid those passive-aggressive comments because they're just confusing and they're not going to go over very well. So the next thing I want you to avoid when someone is violating your boundaries is don't withdraw from the relationship, because that's going to prevent you from having the chance to actually go back and see if the relationship is salvageable. And the only way you can do that with someone who's busting your boundaries is to check it out and say, hey, can I talk to you? There's certain things that are happening in this relationship that I really feel uncomfortable with. Are you willing to have a conversation about it? And if they say yes, and they're willing to listen, and they're also willing to look at their own behavior and change it, great. That's a really good sign that somebody actually cares about you. So they're probably more of a keeper. But if they give you the reaction of, nope, I don't really care how you feel, I'm going to do it anyway, or even blame you, that tells me that the relationship is probably not going to last long term, and you need to consider practicing some detachment in order to distance yourself. The next thing that's really important is you need to know how to get your power back when dealing with people who violate your boundaries. So your next step I want you to do is go watch my video on how to take your power back when dealing with people who violate boundaries. Thanks so much.